Isla Bennett was walking through the crowded rooftop bar, holding a tray of cocktails when a deep, confident voice stopped her. "Excuse me, I think there's been a mistake." She turned, ready with her polite waitress smile, but it faltered when she saw him. He was extremely handsome. Sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and a tailored navy suit that looked expensive. The kind of man who belonged in a penthouse, not a bar in downtown Chicago. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end and like the video, because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. Please hit the like button to show your support. "What seems to be the problem?" Isla asked, straightening up. He looked at the glass in front of him, then back at her. "I ordered a Negroni. This is an old-fashioned." She felt heat rise in her neck. She hadn't messed up an order in months. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'll fix that right away." He studied her, as if surprised by how quickly she owned up to her mistake. "You don't seem like you belong here," he said casually. Isla frowned. "Excuse me." He smiled just a little. "You carry yourself differently, not like the other staff." She felt a little defensive. "I don't know what that means, but I'm just a waitress, sir." He kept looking at her, interested. "Just a waitress?" he repeated as if testing the words. Isla didn't have time for games from rich men like him. Without saying anything more, she turned and went back to the bar, trying to ignore the strange feeling in her chest. Julian Ashford watched her go, curiosity growing inside him. He had come here to escape the high-pressure world of corporate business and mergers. He didn't expect to meet someone interesting. She was beautiful in an easy, natural way. Long, dark hair pulled into a ponytail, hazel eyes that seemed to light up when she was annoyed, and a confidence that didn't match her uniform. His assistant, Evan, leaned in close to whisper, "I just heard the investors in London are waiting for your call." Julian sighed. "They can wait." His eyes went back to Isla as she worked behind the bar, mixing drinks with skill. There was something about her, something he couldn't put his finger on, and Julian Ashford wasn't used to wanting something he couldn't get right away. An hour later, Isla was cleaning the bar when she felt someone near her. She turned and saw him again, watching her. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying not to notice how attractive he was up close. He smiled. "I never got your name." She hesitated before answering. "Isla Bennett." He repeated her name slowly, as if savoring it. "I'm Julian." She nodded, uninterested. "Well, Julian, do you need another drink?" He chuckled. "No, I need to know why you work here." She blinked. "Why does that matter?" He raised an eyebrow. "Because I have a feeling you're more than a waitress." Her stomach twisted. If only he knew. But she wasn't about to share her personal life with some rich stranger. "I don't see how that's any of your business." His smile grew. "Maybe not, but I'd like it to be." She narrowed her eyes. "Is this your way of flirting? Because if it is, you need to work on your technique." To her surprise, he laughed. A real, genuine laugh. "Noted." She shook her head and turned away, but she could still feel his gaze on her. And for some reason, she didn't mind as much as she should have. For the next few nights, Julian kept coming back. Isla told herself it was just a coincidence, that he liked the bar, but deep down she knew better. He always sat in her section, always found a way to talk to her. The more he did, the harder it was to ignore him. One evening he asked her, "So, Isla, what's your dream?" She scoffed. "That's a pretty personal question." He shrugged. "I'm an awfully persistent man." She sighed and wiped her hands on a towel. "If you must know, I'm studying business. But tuition's not cheap, so here I am." He looked at her thoughtfully, like something had clicked in his mind. But he didn't press further. Instead he said, "I think you'll do great things." Something in his voice made her heart skip a beat, and for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, getting to know Julian Ashford wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. The next night, Julian wasn't there. Isla Bennett told herself she didn't care, but as the hours passed, she found herself checking the door more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't like they were friends. He was just a rich guy who liked to flirt, but it didn't feel like that. Just as she was about to take a break, the door swung open, and there he was. But this time, he wasn't alone. A beautiful blonde woman was with him, laughing at something he said. She was elegant, the kind of woman who belonged in his world. Isla Bennett's stomach tightened. She had been silly to think Julian was different from the others. He caught her eye across the room. His expression changed, like he hadn't expected her to see them together, but she had. And just like that, whatever feeling she had for him disappeared. Isla Bennett forced herself to turn away, her heart pounding. This was ridiculous. She had no reason to care who Julian Ashford walked into the bar with. He was just a customer, an arrogant, rich customer who had been playing games with her for the past week, and she had been foolish enough to enjoy it. She grabbed an empty tray and started clearing tables, ignoring him, but she could feel him watching her. It was like his gaze was following her, burning into her skin, asking a silent question. When she returned to the bar, she saw he had moved closer, standing at the counter while the blonde woman stayed at their table, scrolling on her phone. "You're ignoring me," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Isla Bennett didn't look up as she stacked glasses. "I have a job to do." A pause. "She's my business associate." Isla shook her head and let out a short laugh. "I didn't ask." Julian didn't seem bothered. "I know, but I wanted to explain anyway." She finally looked at him, frustration bubbling up. "You don't owe me an explanation, Julian." For a moment, something flickered across his face, but she couldn't tell what it was. He leaned in slightly, his voice soft but intense. "Are we?" Her breath caught, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Enjoy your evening," she said coolly, turning away before he could say anything else. She told herself that was it, that he'd go back to his glamorous life and forget all about her, the waitress. But of course, Julian Ashford wasn't the type of man who gave up easily. The next night, he came back, alone. Isla had expected it, though she wouldn't admit that to anyone. He sat at the bar watching her until she had no choice but to approach him. "What do you want?" she asked, not unkindly, but with enough distance to make it clear she wasn't falling for any of his charm. He tapped the counter. "A conversation." She raised an eyebrow. "Sounds expensive. We charge extra for those." He smirked, but his expression was sincere. "I meant what I said. She's just a business associate, and I don't play games." Isla exhaled slowly, gripping the counter to steady herself. "I don't know what you want from me, Julian." His gaze darkened, something unreadable in his eyes. "I don't either, but I can't seem to stay away." His words sent a shiver down her spine, and she hated it. She hated that, despite everything, she wanted to hear more. But she was smart enough to know better. She straightened and put on the professional smile she had perfected over the years. "Well, if you figure it out, let me know. Until then, can I get you a drink?" He studied her for a moment before nodding. "Negroni." She turned to make the drink, trying to ignore the slight tremble in her fingers. Days passed and Julian kept coming back. Their conversations grew longer, more personal, and despite herself, Isla Bennett found that she enjoyed them. She learned little things about him, like how he hated olives but still ordered martinis just to look intimidating in meetings, or how he had a dog named Maximus that he never had time to walk. He learned about her, too. Not everything, but enough. Isla Bennett kept some parts of her life hidden. The struggles, the sacrifices, the weight of trying to build her future alone. But somehow Julian saw through all of it. One night, as she wiped down the counter, he leaned in a little closer, his voice softer than usual. "Have dinner with me." She froze, her heart pounding. He smirked. "Before you say no, just think about it." She hesitated, biting her lip. "I don't think that's a good idea." He exhaled, tilting his head. "Because you don't want to, or because you do?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence was enough. 2 days passed before she saw him again. This time, he wasn't at the bar. He was waiting outside. Isla stepped out after her shift, rubbing her arms against the evening chill, and froze when she saw him leaning against a sleek black car. "What are you doing here?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. He shrugged. "I figured if you wouldn't have dinner with me on my terms, I'd try yours." She frowned. "What does that mean?" He gestured behind him. That's when she saw it. A small late-night diner across the street. The kind of place she actually liked. The kind of place that felt real. Her throat tightened. "Julian," she started, but he interrupted. "No expectations," he said simply. "Just two people having a meal. Nothing more." She should have walked away, but instead, she found herself nodding. And just like that, everything changed. Dinner was easy. Too easy. They sat in a booth by the window, the city lights casting a soft glow over their table. For the first time, Isla saw a different side of him. He wasn't just the smooth billionaire who haunted her bar with his cryptic smiles. He was funny, sharp, thoughtful in a way she hadn't expected. And when he laughed, really laughed, it did something strange to her chest. She hated that she liked it. "You keep looking at me like you're trying to solve a puzzle," he said, sipping his coffee. She tilted her head. "Maybe I am," he smirked. "And what have you figured out so far?" She hesitated, then said, "That you're not as put together as you pretend to be." Something flickered in his eyes. "Neither are you," he murmured. Her breath caught, and suddenly the space between them felt too small, too charged. She needed to leave. Standing up quickly, she grabbed her coat. "I should go." His expression stayed unreadable, but he didn't stop her. He only said, "I'll see you soon, Isla Bennett." And somehow she knew he would. Isla told herself she wouldn't see Julian again. That dinner had been a mistake, a moment of weakness where she let herself believe, for a second, that someone like him and someone like her could exist in the same world. But Julian Ashford wasn't the type of man who disappeared. The next night he was back at the bar, sitting in his usual spot, watching her with that unreadable look that always made her pulse race. She tried to ignore him, focusing on her job, on the customers, on anything that wasn't the way his presence seemed to change the air around her. But when she finally turned, he was already there, standing at the bar, waiting. "You're persistent," she muttered, wiping down the counter. He smirked. "You make it necessary." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Julian." "I don't say it," he interrupted, his voice softer than usual. "Don't tell me you don't want me here." She swallowed hard, gripping the cloth in her hands. The truth was, she didn't want him to leave, and that terrified her. "I don't fit into your world," she said, finally forcing herself to meet his gaze. His smirk faded. "Then maybe my world needs to change." The words sent a shiver down her spine. But before she could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught her attention. A man had stumbled in, drunk and aggressive, shouting at the hostess. Isla recognized him instantly, one of their regulars, the kind who didn't know when to stop. She sighed, already moving to step in. "I've got this," she muttered to Julian, stepping around the bar. But before she could reach the man, he grabbed the hostess's arm, yanking her forward. In an instant, Julian was between them, his hand gripping the man's wrist in a way that made it clear he wasn't going to let go. "There's no room for negotiation. Let go," Julian said, his voice calm but dangerous. The drunk man blinked, clearly surprised. "Who the hell are you?" Julian tightened his grip just slightly. "The man who's about to make you regret that decision." For a moment, Isla Bennett thought the man might fight back, but then he yanked his arm away, muttering something under his breath, and stumbled toward the exit. Julian didn't move until the door swung shut behind him. Only then did he turn to Isla, his face unreadable. "Are you okay?" Isla exhaled slowly and nodded. "Yeah, I just didn't expect that." He studied her for a moment before replying, "Neither did I." There was a silent moment between them, something unspoken that made the world around them feel blurry, and Isla Bennett realized with startling clarity that she was in trouble. Because Julian Ashford wasn't just another billionaire with a charming smile and a fancy suit, he was something else entirely, and she had no idea how to stop herself from falling for him. The next morning, Isla woke up to a text from an unknown number. "Dinner tonight. No excuses." Her heart raced. She knew exactly who it was from. Despite all the warnings in her head, she typed back one word. "Fine." Dinner with Julian was exactly what she expected, but also nothing like she expected. He didn't take her to some fancy five-star restaurant with white tablecloths and a dress code. Instead, he took her to a quiet, intimate place tucked away in the city. The lighting was soft and the food was simple but perfect. "You surprised me," she admitted, sitting across from him with a glass of wine in her hand. His lips curved slightly. "Good. I'd hate to be predictable." She took a sip and studied him carefully. "So tell me something real. He tilted his head. Something real? No business talk, no charm, just something real about you? He was quiet for a moment, then said, I don't trust people easily. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She put her glass down. Why not? He ran a hand through his hair. Because when you grow up with money, you learn early on that most people only want something from you. She frowned. That sounds lonely. He met her gaze. It is. Her chest tightened. She had expected a lot of things from Julian Ashford, but not this. And that scared her more than anything, because for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was protecting herself from him or from how he made her feel. Isla knew she should have walked away after that night, but she didn't. She couldn't. Julian had a way of pulling her in, making her forget all the reasons they didn't make sense. And before she knew it, he wasn't just a customer at her bar. He was something more. Something dangerous. Something she wasn't sure she could survive. One evening after dinner, they walked through the city. Julian suddenly stopped and turned to face her. I have to leave for London tomorrow, he said, studying her carefully. Her stomach dropped. For how long? A week, maybe 2. She nodded, keeping her expression neutral. That makes sense. He frowned. That's all you have to say? She shrugged. It's your job, right? His jaw tightened. Isla Bennett. She exhaled and crossed her arms. What do you want me to say, Julian? That I'll miss you? His voice was quiet but firm. Yes. Her breath caught, and for once, she couldn't think of anything clever to say. So she whispered, I'll miss you. His eyes darkened. Before she could say anything else, he stepped closer, his hands sliding to her waist. Her heart pounded as he leaned in, his lips brushing her ear as he murmured, Say it again. She swallowed hard. I'll miss you, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Then he kissed her. It wasn't slow or hesitant. It was everything they had been holding back, everything they had pretended wasn't there. And in that moment, Isla Bennett knew there was no walking away from him now. Isla stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, her fingers gripping the stem of her champagne flute as she scanned the glittering crowd. The air buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the soft hum of a string quartet playing in the background. It was the kind of event she had never been invited to before, until now, until Julian Ashford had changed everything. Isla Bennett wasn't sure how she had ended up here. One moment, she had told herself she could keep things casual. She had convinced herself that whatever had happened between her and Julian before he left for London was just a brief moment, nothing more. But then he had come back, and instead of fading away, their connection had only grown stronger. Now, here she was, standing in the middle of his world. She smoothed down her midnight blue gown, the one Julian had sent to her apartment earlier that day, with a note that simply said, Wear this. I'll be waiting. Isla had almost refused, but something inside her had wanted to see him, wanted to step into his world, even if it was just for one night. Now she wasn't sure if she had made a mistake. A deep, familiar voice sent a shiver down her spine. She turned, and there he was. Julian stood just a few feet away, dressed in a black tuxedo that fit him perfectly, probably made just for him. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, and a slow, knowing smile curved his lips. You clean up nicely, he said, stepping closer. Isla Bennett raised an eyebrow, trying to ignore how her pulse quickened. Are you saying I don't usually? His smirk deepened. I'm saying that tonight, I might have a hard time keeping my hands to myself. Her breath hitched, but she forced herself to roll her eyes. You're impossible. And yet, you're here, he replied with a teasing grin. Before she could respond, a man approached and clapped Julian on the shoulder. Kensington, there you are. I've been meaning to discuss your latest acquisition. Julian's jaw tightened, but he turned to the man with a polite nod. Excuse me for a moment, he murmured to Isla before stepping aside to talk. Isla exhaled and took a sip of her champagne. She didn't belong here. She could feel it in the way people looked at her, in the curious glances they exchanged. They all knew who Julian was, and knew she wasn't one of them. A woman with perfectly styled hair and a designer gown stepped up next to her, sipping her drink. You must be Isla Bennett, the woman said smoothly. Isla turned cautious. And you are? Vivian Street. Claire, the woman replied. The name sounded expensive, and Isla had no doubt it was. Julian and I go way back. Isla forced a polite smile. Is that so? Vivian tilted her head. Men like Julian Ashford don't settle down. They get distracted for a while, but eventually they remember who they are. Isla's grip on her glass tightened. And who is he exactly? Vivian's smile didn't change. Someone who plays by his own rules. I wouldn't get too comfortable if I were you. Before Isla could respond, Vivian sauntered away, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and well-timed words. Isla's stomach twisted. She wasn't naive. She knew Julian was powerful, wealthy, and used to getting what he wanted. But was she just a temporary amusement? She barely had time to think about it before Julian was back at her side, his eyes sharp as he studied her. What did she say to you? He asked, his voice low. Nothing I didn't already know, Isla replied, trying to keep her tone steady. Julian's jaw clenched. I should go, Isla said, setting her champagne glass down on a passing tray. This isn't my world. Before she could walk away, his hand caught her wrist, stopping her. You are my world, he said, his voice firm. Her breath caught. He exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening just a little. Come with me, he said, his tone soft but commanding. She hesitated, but something in his eyes, something raw and real, made her nod. He led her through the grand hall, past curious glances and whispered conversations, until they reached a set of glass doors that opened onto a private terrace. The cool night air wrapped around them as they stepped outside. Julian turned to her, his expression unreadable. I don't care what Vivian or anyone else says. You belong here if you want to. Isla Bennett swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. And if I don't? His gaze darkened. Then I'll walk away from all of this. Her eyes widened. Julian, I mean it. Her voice was filled with emotion. None of it matters without you. She searched his face for any sign of hesitation or doubt, but there was none. And just like that, the last of her resistance vanished. She moved forward, crashing her lips against his, pouring every fear, every feeling, every unspoken word into the kiss. Julian responded instantly. His hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing heavily. Stay, he murmured. She exhaled, gripping the lapels of his tuxedo. I'm scared. I know, he whispered, brushing his thumb over her cheek. But I'll spend the rest of my life proving you don't have to be. And in that moment, Isla Bennett knew she wasn't running anymore. The city stretched below them, its golden lights shimmering like a sea of stars. As Isla stood on the terrace, wrapped in Julian's arms, the distant hum of music and conversation from the ballroom faded into nothing. Only the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat and the warmth of his touch remained. She had never felt this way before, like she was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying, yet completely irresistible. Julian exhaled softly, his fingers tracing slow circles on her back. You're thinking too much, he murmured. Isla Bennett huffed a quiet laugh and tilted her head to meet his gaze. That's what I do. His lips curved slightly, but there was something deeper in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made her shiver. Then let me make it simple for you, he said, before she could respond. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Isla's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a delicate diamond bracelet that shimmered under the terrace lights. Julian, she started, but he stopped her with a gentle shake of his head. This isn't a bribe, he said. It's not some grand gesture to convince you of anything. It's just a reminder. Her throat tightened. Of what? That you belong with me, he said quietly but firmly, leaving no room for doubt. No matter what anyone says, no matter what you think. Isla's fingers trembled as he lifted the bracelet from the box and slid it carefully onto her wrist. It was light and cool against her skin, but it carried a weight far heavier than gold or diamonds. She looked up at him, searching for the right words, but nothing felt like enough. Instead, she whispered, Why me? His expression softened. Because you see me, not my name, not my money, just me. Her chest ached at the raw honesty in his voice. She had spent so much time convincing herself they were too different, that his world would eventually swallow her whole. But standing here, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her fingertips, she realized something. She didn't want to run anymore. She reached up, cupping his face between her hands, and kissed him. It was slow this time, deliberate, filled with everything unspoken between them since the moment they met. Julian responded instantly. His arms tightened around her, deepening the kiss until the rest of the world disappeared. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "Stay with me tonight," he whispered. Isla Bennett's heart pounded, but she didn't hesitate. "Yes." The car ride to his penthouse was a blur of stolen glances and quiet anticipation. By the time they stepped into the sleek, modern space overlooking the city, Isla barely had time to take in her surroundings before Julian pulled her to him again. His hands traced her waist, and his lips brushed against her ear as he murmured, "Tell me if you want me to stop." She shook her head, threading her fingers through his hair. "I don't." That was all it took. The night unfolded like a slow-burning dream. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered name, spoken as if it was the only thing that mattered. And maybe for that moment, it was. When morning came, Isla woke to the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian was still beside her, his arm draped over her waist, his breathing steady and even. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply exist in this space, to memorize the way his skin felt against hers, the warmth of his body, the quiet safety she hadn't realized she was craving. But reality always had a way of creeping in. Carefully, she slipped out of bed, grabbing the silk robe draped over a nearby chair. As she moved toward the windows, her eyes landed on a framed photograph on one of the shelves. It showed Julian standing beside an older man, both of them dressed in suits with unreadable expressions. She hadn't asked much about his family. He never talked about them, and she had assumed it was intentional. But something about that photo made her pause. Before she could think more on it, she felt movement behind her. "You're up early." Julian's voice was thick with sleep as he stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing a soft kiss to her shoulder. Isla Bennett leaned into him, exhaling softly. "Couldn't sleep," he hummed against her skin. "Thinking again?" She smiled despite herself. "Always." He turned her gently to face him, studying her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "Talk to me." She hesitated, then glanced back at the photo. "Your father?" His expression shifted slightly, but he didn't look away. "Yes." She traced the edge of the frame with her fingertip. "You don't talk about him." "There's not much to say." His voice was even, but Isla could hear the weight beneath it. "He built the empire I now run, and he expected me to follow in his footsteps without question." Isla turned back to him. "And did you?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "For a long time, I thought I had to, that my worth was measured by how well I upheld his legacy." She watched him carefully. "And now?" His gaze met hers, something unspoken passing between them. "Now I'm starting to realize that maybe my worth isn't tied to his expectations." Isla's heart ached at the quiet vulnerability in his voice. She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "You don't have to be who they want you to be, Julian." His grip tightened slightly. "And who do you think I am?" She smiled, brushing her thumb over his knuckles. "Someone who's still figuring it out." For a long moment, he just looked at her, as if she had said something he wasn't expecting. Then, without warning, he kissed her. It was slow, unhurried, filled with something deeper than passion, something real. And in that moment, Isla Bennett knew that whatever happened next, whatever obstacles they still had to face, this was real, and she